school leaders. I am just kicked back in the church nursery for this prep talk this week. Hey, this week we are in a special focus unit. It is out of the book of Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. The title of the lesson is Created for a Purpose. And the point is, before you were born, God designed you with great value. This Sunday is Sanctity of Human Life Sunday in Southern Baptist circles. This came about from a 1984 proclamation from President Ronald Reagan. At that time, that was the 11th anniversary of the 1973 Roe versus Wade decision. And so they've set aside they've set aside the third Sunday of every January as Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. And so in our LifeWay lessons over the years, this third Sunday of January has always dealt somehow with the sanctity of human life. Now, if you would like to have some statistics on abortions, the number per day, all that, you can Google that. Lots of information out there on numbers and statistics if you want to mention that in class. But you know, it's important to note that this is not just an anti-abortion lesson. This is a pro-life lesson. Okay, that's life in general, human life. Now, as you go into the lesson, I want you to be very sensitive to your class. Please don't say things like, you know, anyone in their right mind, they would never have an abortion. Or please don't say anything like, you know, a real Christian would never consider having an abortion. In fact, those statements may come up from people who are very pro-life people in your class. And that's great. I'm a pro-life person myself. But we've got to be sensitive to other people because, you know, we really don't know everyone's story in the class. We don't know, in fact, we'd probably be surprised if we knew who in our class has had an abortion or who has a family member that has done that or their girlfriend or whatever. So we just need to be very sensitive. And we need to speak the truth, but we need to speak the truth in love. So let's be sensitive to people. Now, a good resource, I believe, to complement your lesson this week is The Purpose-Driven Life. I think most people have that book. It's been out for, gosh, close to 15 years, if not longer than that. And if not, I'm sure your church library has a few extra copies. Chapter 2 of the Purpose-Driven Life book by Rick Warren is entitled, You Are Not an Accident. And he makes a statement that there are no such thing really as illegitimate children. But there are illegitimate parents who maybe don't plan to have children, but every child is precious in God's sight, and God has a plan for them. Now we look, as we look in the Jeremiah chapter 1, we can look down in verse 5, and he talks about being formed in the womb, that God formed Jeremiah in the womb before he was even born. This is a very famous verse when the pro-life verses that is used. I'm going to give you a preacher's take on this, some alliteration. If you want to use this in your class, please feel free to. So we see in verse 5 that he was formed in the womb. That means he was created by God. We also see that he was sanctified. He was set apart for a task. That means he was consecrated to do something. Also, he says he was appointed for, there was a plan, there was a purpose for Jeremiah's life even before he was born. That means he was called to a task. We get down to verse 6 and we see that word youth. And in the Leader's Guide, I gleaned out that that Hebrew term that's for youth can mean anything from an infant to a teenager to a young guy, young warrior. Jeremiah comes up with the excuse when God says, you know, I've got this plan for you, that I'm too young, that I'm inexperienced. And can you imagine, let's say, a 13-year-old in your congregation being convinced by God that he is called to preach or whatever? And I'm sure that 13-year-old would think, you know, I've only seen a bunch of old guys preaching. I'm not that old. I don't have any experience. And so I kind of relate it to that. You know, Jeremiah probably grew up and heard about prophets and you know, picture them as old guys and these old stately men of God, and he was just a young kid, and that wasn't who he was at that particular time. But God has, you know, he doesn't look for our ability, but what does he look for? Our availability. And that is shown time and time again throughout the scriptures. We see that God uses the weak to show his strength. He uses Moses, who has some kind of speech impediment, to speak before Pharaoh. Here in our text, we see Jeremiah. He's calling him, he's very young. We see David, who is the youngest of his family that's going to be king. We see Rahab, who's a prostitute, who is in the lineage of the Messiah. We see Saul in the New Testament, a persecutor of Christians, those who he gives the okay on death sentences to Christians, forces them to blaspheme. And we see this guy who is so anti-Christian become the greatest evangelist that we've ever known. So like I said, God's not looking for ability, he's looking for availability. Now, all this to say that all lives matter. All lives matter. And by that, I am not discounting at all the Black Lives Matter movement. There's some real validity to that as we see the things that are going on against African Americans. But we look at the preborn, we look at youth, we look at elderly people. All of these lives matter to God. We get down to verses 9 and 10, and we see that God confirms the calling on Jeremiah's life. Now, if people in every stage of life are precious, does your church programs, do they reflect that? Our church programs, the ministries that we do, should be trying all we can do to reach every age group with age-appropriate methods and age-appropriate teaching. A lot of times we'll emphasize families, and we won't do anything for kids or anything for youth, or a big youth church, but we don't do anything for senior adults, or a big senior adult church. You know what I'm saying? We tend to fall into one or two categories, and I know you can't be really all things to all people. You don't want to spread yourself too thin, but we should be able to successfully reach every age group that's in our community. Now, if you're feeling brave, perhaps these are questions that you might want to bring up, or if not, you might want to be prepared because somebody in your class may actually bring up these questions. Let's think about a baby shower policy for unwed mothers. Well, we just don't do that. You say we don't want to condone premarital sex, so we're not going to have baby showers for unwed mothers. Okay, I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't have that policy, but objectively examine that policy if that's the case with you. Should we shun those who are choosing life over having an abortion? Would we rather the young unwed mother go and have an abortion, maybe not even tell us about it? So that's one thing to think about. Also, if all lives are precious, what about those criminals on death row? I don't know if you want to get into the death row, I don't know if you want to get into the death penalty argument or not, but that's a point that may come up. Well, let me say this in closing. In the 1960s, you've probably seen these pictures, or some of you may have experienced this. 1960s African-American men who were protesting, carrying those placards, those signs that said, "I am a man." Basically what they were saying was, treat me with the dignity and respect that any other man would have. Now, as we get down to this in modern times, we could say all ages, whether they're male, female, I am a person. I have an eternal soul. Treat me with the dignity and respect that any other person would have. And I believe that extends to the preborn as well. Well, next week we start a brand new unit all in the book of Philippians. That's one of my favorite books. I love to read and study out of Philippians, so I'm looking forward to that. Hope you have a great rest of the week. I know here in Arkansas our temperatures have gone from snow on Friday, Saturday, really cold on Sunday, and then yesterday we were in the 70s or 60s, and today in the 70s. So it's crazy weather here. So don't forget to pray for your class. Hope you have a great week.